Okay, so hey guys, in this video we're going to demonstrate how to trace the debug port from the microcontroller on a FitBit Charge HR circuit board. So we can see here is the circuit board that I pulled out of the FitBit Charge device before we made any modifications to it. Okay, and the reason we chose this particular device is it's super old and you can buy these things on eBay for real cheap, right? So you can buy a lot of them that are maybe broken. When they say they're broken, they typically just have batteries that don't charge well or the screen is dim or something like that. They're not inoperable per se. So you can get these things for cheap, and then in the process of doing this, we're gonna probably damage a few of the circuit boards, but that's okay because they're super cheap. And the reason we're doing this is because we want to program the Hermes hypervisor onto these devices, right? So what we want to do is we want to read the stock binary off of the FitBit device's microcontroller, and then we want to modify it to run as a guest inside of the Hermes hypervisor, right? And in order to do that, we need access to the debug port so that we can read the software off of the microcontroller. Okay, and so if we flip this thing over, what we're going to find is that there's actually a bunch of these test points on the back of the board, right? So the test points are just bare gold-plated copper that are used to test the device in the factory and program the firmware onto it. Okay, and so that's where we're going to solder our wires to. Okay, so some of those test points, even though they're unlabeled, right, that's where the debug port is brought out to. Right, so you can see here is this is the CPU that I've removed from the device on the other side. Okay, so you just use a heat gun, heat that up a little bit, it'll come right off. And then what you'll be left with is this blank BGA pad. Okay? Now what you don't want to do is you definitely don't want to solder wires to the balls on that pad, right? Because those balls are only held onto the circuit board with some really tiny little bit of glue. And the lever action from the wire, if you solder it onto that, will just tear the ball off and you won't be able to trace the wire anymore. Okay, so instead what we're going to do is we're actually going to solder test wires to the test points on the other side of the board. Okay, and then I'm going to trace continuity from the test wires that I soldered to the back of the board onto the BGA footprint like this. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is when you solder the wires to the test points on the back of the board, I've shown here how I've done that, right? So what you do is you solder the wire down to the test point, and then you're going to need to glue it onto the board to make them stick, right? Because you don't want to inadvertently pull those test points off of the board accidentally as you're shuffling around with the wires. Okay, so solder a little tiny wire onto the test point, glue it down with some hot glue or some super glue, and then flip the board over so that the BGA footprint is facing up. And then I'll demonstrate kind of how we're going to test this thing, right? So we're going to have the wires. You can't really see the wires here very well, but you can see my right hand with the red lead from the ohm meter holding these wires that I've soldered to these test points, okay? And I'm going to separate the wires so that they're not touching each other. And then under the microscope, you would have to do this under the microscope. I'm demonstrating it without a microscope here. But normally you would do it under the microscope, right? So I'm going to just touch one of the balls on the footprint, and then I'm going to check each one of these wires that I've soldered to the test point. Okay, and when I find one of the wires that has continuity with the ball, then I know that that's where the test point is brought out to.